Welcome back from lunch, everyone. We're going to get our next panel started. Now, you heard the coach talk today, and also the Lieutenant Governor, as well as Dan Garza, talk about entrepreneurship, but one of the biggest detriments to a small business are the regulations that control small business. And we're going to talk about regulations, not just federal regulations, but also state regulations that affect small business on their day-to-day lives. The moderator today is going to be Jorge Lima. Now, Jorge is the Deputy Chief of Staff and Policy Director at the Libre Day Initiative. Jorge brings extensive experience in policy development and a keen understanding of the impact policies have on our economy, businesses, and communities. Jorge previously served as Strategic Policy Advisor to Governor Luis Fortuno of Puerto Rico, where he focused on economic development and played a key role on major initiatives to spur private sector investment and the approval of a public-private partnership for the San Juan International Airport, the first of its kind in the U.S. Mr. Lima also practiced land use law as an associate at the law firm of Holland & Knight, a real well-known D.C. law firm, and began his career as an attorney for the city of Miami. He holds a J.D. from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Miami. Without further ado, Jorge Lima.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. I like that. I like that. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us today. I know that I speak on behalf of everybody that's part of the Libre Institute in thanking you for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who are from New Mexico, a big thank you. It's the first time I've ever been to the state. I really am enjoying myself. I had the kind of luck of being able to bring my wife and one-year-old daughter with me on this trip. And while we've been up here in the hotel, they've been out in the city, and I've been kind of texting with her, just keeping up to date, and she keeps telling me the same thing over and over again. Everybody here is so nice. From the bus driver that took us to the car rental, to the hotel staff here, last night at the restaurant, everybody is extremely, extremely friendly. And we very much appreciate that. So thank you for that warm welcome to the Southwest. I know I truly appreciate it. What a nice lunch session we had, huh? I mean, I was a little bit worried, I'm not going to lie, because when Michael told me we had to come speak to you for an hour and 15 minutes about regulations right after lunch with full bellies, I didn't know how we were going to keep it up. But I have no doubt. And I have no doubt because I'm going to introduce you to an incredible panel. We were sitting in here about 20 minutes before we got started, and the conversation itself just took off, and they're a lively bunch. I'm really excited for them to come up here and share a little bit of what they know and what they practice in their day-to-day lives. Regulations. I think it's a term that most people use all of the time, or hear all the time at the very least, and don't really grasp what it means unless paperwork, penalties, money, calling an attorney, calling an accountant, as a small business owner, just trying to get through this endless list of regulations, and it is truly endless. And we'll go into that a little bit now because every time you turn, it seems like they're adding a new one. It's a machine that just doesn't stop, and there's folks whose career actually is to continue to add to those regulation roles. But without further ado, I want to bring the three panelists up. I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about them as we get started, and a little bit of what each of them, I think, will be able to contribute to this conversation, which all of you can then take away. First, and I'm just going to go by order of name tags here, Miss Minda McGonigal. She's currently a small herself. She's the owner of McGonigal Government Relations and serves as a professional contract lobbyist, working both in legislative and regulatory areas. She's also the New Mexico Director for the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Her areas of lobbying expertise include small business issues, construction, real estate, healthcare, insurance, finance, economic development, and energy. Anybody here have a business that does all of that? Because she's the person you need to talk to. She's on the board of the Northern New Mexico chapter of the National Association of Women Business Owners and serves as the public policy director there. She's the past recipient of the chapter's Public Policy Advocate of the Year Award. And, as she told me earlier, most importantly, a very, very proud New Mexican. She was raised in Santa Fe, graduated from the University of New Mexico, and currently lives in Albuquerque, where she is married and has a grown daughter living in Vermont. So warm welcome to Minda. Thank you for being with us here today. Next to Minda, we have Reed Rubenstein, who's a Senior VP of Litigation at Cause of Action, a nonpartisan government oversight organization that fights government regulatory overreach and promotes economic freedom. If you haven't heard of Cause of Action, you should. They're the good guys out there who are constantly going after the government when the government oversteps and thinks that nobody's watching. Cause of Action is watching them. Reed has also served as the U.S. Chamber's Senior Counsel for Environment, Technology, and Regulatory Affairs. In private practice, he represented trade associations, local governments, and domestic and international companies from Fortune 500 corporations to high-tech startups. He's widely published, lectured often on regulatory and environmental matters, testified before Congress on overcriminalization policy, and appeared in or been quoted by media ranging from ABC News to the New York Times to the National Law Review. He graduated with honors and the highest distinction from the University of Michigan and has received his MA from Michigan and his JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Reed, thanks for being with us today. And last but certainly not least, Naomi Lopez Bauman. She's currently the Director of Healthcare Policy at the Goldwater Institute. She's worked as a Director of Research for the Illinois Policy Institute and served as a public policy consultant conducting research on barriers to entrepreneurship, federal and state healthcare programs, and social and economic well-being. And we like to proudly say she's also the author of the Libre Institute's newest study, La Oportunidad, which looks into Hispanic entrepreneurship and the impact of local licensing laws. We have copies of that study provided outside for those who are interested, and it's also available on our website. Naomi previously served as a director of both the Center for Enterprise and Opportunity at the Project on Children at the Pacific Research Center and was a member of the California Senate Bipartisan Task Force on Homelessness. She's appeared on ABC, PBS, CNN, CNBC, Fox News, and MSNBC. She's authored over 100 studies and commentaries, and her opinion articles have appeared in several national and local periodicals. She holds a BA from Trinity University in Texas and an MA from Johns Hopkins University. Please welcome Naomi to the panel as well. So with all those credentials aside, let's start talking about regulations. I think we promised each panelist they'd be able to talk for 3 minutes, a little bit more about what they are bringing to the table and what it is that they do. So, Minda, why don't you get us started?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. Literally, and it's good that you're awake. That was a wonderful luncheon. We appreciate you considering this a good investment of your time, and we think that from what you've seen so far and how the afternoon is going to finish, that you will find that it really was a good choice. I am so privileged to be here, especially with these two panelists. Wow, they bring so much knowledge. It's great. I am a lobbyist. I, by trade, represent businesses and associations in front of the legislature and in front of state regulators. I am a small business person. So I understand things a bit from both places. Today, I am mostly representing the National Federation of Independent Business, which represents small businesses throughout the country. We do a lot of work in Washington, D.C. We have our legal center, and then each state has its own state director, and I serve as the state director. We are member-driven in that our members vote on what our issues are, and we keep counsel with our members so that we can go to the state legislature and, when necessary, to regulators to remind them of what they need to do to be fair, be balanced, and to help us do what we do best, which is be in business and create jobs. So I encourage all of you to go to the nfib.com, which is the National Federation of Independent Business website, and see what we might be able to do for you. There are a lot of resources, and if you look at the website, you can also go to the state page. It has my phone number. I'm happy to talk to you. We hope you will take advantage of the resources. Love to hear from you, and if you think we're worthy, it would be great if you would consider joining us, because we understand it's about small business. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Reed Rubenstein. I'm the SVP of Litigation for Cause of Action. I'm a Washington lawyer, and I'm here to help. You know, it's funny. I go around the country, I say that, and everybody laughs, and I can't seem to quite figure out why. I began practicing law really at the beginning of the second Reagan administration. So I've had the opportunity to watch things evolve and change. And they have. We are living in a time of unprecedented regulatory growth. Really beginning in January of 2009, we've seen an expansion in the power and vitality, frankly, of the regulatory state, unlike anything we've seen really since the 1930s and the Great Depression. I was in private practice for many, many years, representing a whole host of clients, primarily businesses, often very large businesses, which, you know, those are the folks who pay the freight, and it has provided I think, some useful perspective and information hopefully we can share today. Cause of Action is, as Jorge said, a 501c3 nonprofit government watchdog organization. Essentially what we try to do is ensure that there is a return address on bad government behavior, of which unfortunately there is no lack at the present time. We use a variety of tools, including litigation, communications, Freedom of Information Act investigations, and education to try and explain to the American public what the costs of government overreach and government abuse truly are. And hopefully today we can spend some time talking first about why and how we sort of got to the point where we're at, and then more importantly, what we can do about it to help make things better.
Thank you, Reed.
Thank you so much for having us here today, Jorge. You know, anytime you talk about Hispanics and you Google Hispanics, for example, one of the first things that will pop up is the Hispanic demographics, the Hispanic population, how Hispanics are really changing the United States. And there's been no shortage of attention to that very important issue. But one of the areas that you haven't really seen much about, and probably deserves a lot more attention, is the role that the Hispanics are playing in the nation's workforce and that transformation, how rapidly it's actually occurring. And even more importantly, the impact that Hispanics are having on the small business formation, where the majority of America's jobs are created. As recently as 2003, 1 in 6 entrepreneurs were Hispanic. Today it's about 1 in 5. So it's rapidly changing. A lot of previous research has shown that there's a really strong relationship between government regulation and entrepreneurship. More recently, we've seen some studies on the relationship between occupational licensing and how they impact low-wage sectors of the economy. In the study that's being released today by the Libre Institute, I examined occupational licensing in the construction industry. That's an industry where Hispanics are overrepresented compared to the total population. And there's some really good reasons for that. One is that it's a very physically demanding industry. It's very hard work, and not everyone is up to it. Another reason is that it doesn't require an enormous amount of education, and it does not require an enormous amount of capital to perform those duties. And so that's one of the reasons why you see so many Hispanics in that industry. So what I did is I took a look at whether or not there was an even stronger relationship between occupational licensing and Hispanic entrepreneurship, and my work showed that there probably is a very strong one. This is the first study that attempts to assess how regulation on low-income occupations, where a lot of us Hispanics, start out at, might be disproportionately impacting our community, and as a result, impacting entrepreneurship and job creation and income mobility for us. In the study, I examined 3 states, Florida, New Mexico, and Texas, and took a look at occupational licensing in the construction industry in these 3 states. Texas had the fewest requirements. New Mexico had the most. And not all that surprisingly, Texas and Florida saw rapid Hispanic entrepreneurial growth in the construction industry over the past decade and a half. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into that type of growth, but occupational licensing is absolutely one of those. You can even take a look at states that have slow growth. You still see a lot of entrepreneurship in that area. Unfortunately, you're not seeing it as much in New Mexico, and I think that occupational licensing has a lot to do with that. And in fact, in New Mexico, the growth rate was actually negative in that industry for Hispanics. And so I think that's something that needs a lot of further investigation. But the question for policymakers here in New Mexico and other businesses is, how can you best unleash the entrepreneurial potential of the Hispanic community? We know we're important, we know we're growing, we know we're going to be increasingly important as the demographics continue to change and as we have a larger share of small businesses in this nation. Anytime you're imposing barriers to entry on industries, particularly the low-wage occupations, you're going to have a disproportionate effect on Hispanic entrepreneurship, and that's going to have a lot of impacts that will be very widely felt. A failure to remove these barriers is not only going to limit Hispanics' entrepreneurial potential, it's going to be a really important missed opportunity for the nation as a whole. And that's what the focus of my study is about, and that is what I think demands a lot of attention right now in the policy work, in the policy area. I work for the Goldwater Institute, and we're a 501c3 organization that focuses on public policy and litigation in ways to basically promote liberty. And we do it in Arizona as well as across the nation in the States.
Thank you, Naomi. So as you guys can see, we have a lot to talk about. I think what we're hoping to get out of this is not that you will become an expert on regulations, but at least you'll learn a little bit more about why regulations are being formed, what are some recent trends, and what are the things that you should be looking for, being aware of, or things that you can actually do to perhaps kind of change what it is we see in the landscape. So let's go ahead and just get started. I'll be asking some questions that I have previously prepared, but if the audience have questions, there's note cards or kind of paper on the tables you're sitting. Feel free to write the question. We have Libre staff, raise your hand, guys, that they're willing to come around. They'll pick up those questions, bring them to me, and we can incorporate your questions throughout the conversation. So I hope for this to be a very engaging conversation. We look to hear from you guys throughout. Reed, the first question I have is for you. Could you kind of set the landscape? So, recently there's been a lot of news and analysis about this kind of big surge of regulations over the last couple of years. Can you kind of confirm that trend for us and just give us a little bit of explanation of why you think this is happening?
Sure. Short question. I'm going to give you a kind of a longish answer, though. When you think about regulations, at least at the federal level, there are really sort of three kinds. The first is the kinds put out by agencies through notice and comment, rules and guidance. The second is actions by the executive, by the president. Executive orders, you may have heard about that in the news lately, and what are called memoranda. They're published in the Federal Register. The third is what we call stealth regulation, where agencies, without ever really becoming public, take actions designed to change business behavior throughout the economy. Some of you may have heard about Operation Choke Point. Choke Point is an initiative, as far as we can tell, comes out of the Department of Justice, using authorities that are granted the bank regulators to effectively put out of business entire categories of legal, though politically disfavored companies. Those are kind of the sets the framework, the regulatory framework at the federal level. What we've seen over the last 8 or 9 years, though, is a willingness at all levels in the federal government to exercise power with much more vigor in terms of the president issuing executive orders in a host of areas, and in terms of the agencies. The number of regulations, and this is an imprecise but potentially useful marker, has almost increased by 40% in that time. From about 150,000 plus or minus to 220, 230,000, depending on who's doing the counting. Many of these affect very directly all of the important businesses in the United States, many of the small businesses as well. And it plays out very directly for big businesses. And big businesses work very closely with government agencies often in terms of helping structure and write these regulations. But small businesses, by and large, do not have a voice at the table for a whole host of reasons we can talk about. And so what ends up happening is that the playing field gets tilted. It's tilted generally in favor of big businesses versus smaller ones, and it's tilted in favor of kind of old established technologies against new and innovative ones. Neither of those situations is terribly good in the long run for the economy or for the citizens. A second thing that this does is that it limits your ability to really have some control or influence over how you're going to live your life. Because here's the hard reality. There is almost nobody outside of the few people who make their living doing so who is following what the agencies are doing on a day-to-day basis, who are reading the Federal Register. Federal Register is where the agencies publish, give notice of what they're going to do. Last year it was about 80,000 pages long, single-spaced, small type. And it's very hard to kind of know what the agencies are up to. Even when they're following the law that requires them to provide some notice to the public. And then the third problem is that not only are they not terribly transparent, the agencies, but they're really not accountable. See, if a politician does something you don't like, you can vote him out of office. You can't vote out of office GS-15, a federal employee whose job it is to write regulations. Can't do it. And they are not answerable to you or pretty much anybody else other than their immediate supervisor, and even then, because of the work rules, they have a lot of independence. And so in order to ensure that kind of all of our rights and freedoms are protected, we go to the courts, which what cause of action do? We litigate vigorously. The problem is that we tend to defer very substantially to the agencies. And this plays out, for example, if an agency wants to regulate a given substance, for example, EPA. EPA is kind of the paradigm of an aggressive agency. It wants to regulate a particular substance. So it can take a look at a series of studies. If there are 10 studies that say X and one that says Y, the agencies say, oh, well, we're going to do Y because we like that one better. And the courts are going to say, oh, science is hard. We're not going to second guess. So that is kind of the general framework. And when the agencies are unleashed, as they have been, obviously the opportunities for mischief are legion. And that's what we've seen.
So Zominda, he is confirming that we're now being kind of bombarded with all these new regulations coming, and for now, let's just consider the federal level. I mean, there's estimates that put federal regulations in the trillions of dollars in terms of cost to businesses per year. You break that down into individual businesses, and you're looking at tens of thousands per employee. You deal with small businesses in different capacities. You're a small business owner yourself. What does that mean when you have to spend your time as a business owner focusing and being aware of costs that are not even related to the core of your business?
Well, I think you're right. You, as a small business owner, you're thinking about costs. The truth is, you don't have time to be considering all these regulations all the time until you get hurt. Or until somebody mentions, wow, did you know this happened? And you have that moment where you go, oh, that could be me too. It really is hard to not feel like you are a victim of these huge entities making decisions, as Reed said, larger companies, larger concerns. It's being done on Capitol Hill or at, in federal agencies. And then that state agencies go, oh, look how well that worked. We should try that. Let's just tweak it a little more. So you as business people aren't students of regulation. You can't be. You are busy providing goods and services. You are busy trying to employ people. You are busy trying to make a profit. So what happens is, I think you have to have a certain level of risk tolerance that when that moment comes, that you get that letter or you get that phone call or you get that legal paper that says you screwed up and you're in trouble and you better pay us a lot of money or close your doors, that you're able to stay standing, not faint. And then is when you start looking at how you're going to deal with it. People, small business people are resilient. Small business people pay attention. It is in that inherent paying attention that you're getting to exist. But the truth is, we're very vulnerable. Resilient, tough, but vulnerable. And that does seem to get missed in the landscape. That's why you have the Hispano Chamber. That's why you have Libre. That's why you have NFIB, and you have other associations holding you up. We're all behind you, and that is what is important about affiliation with each other. The more you talk about these things with each other, with your like businesses, in your hometowns, that's how you start having a chance to maybe get a little bit ahead so that you don't have a huge problem. And most importantly, when you do have a big problem, there are resources. That's why NFIB has a legal center. I was talking to Reed, we do work with Reed. So when that moment hits, it's not suddenly you're out of business. It's just that you're now having to deal with the situation. So you have to stay strong and optimistic, even in the light of what looks like a huge crisis. If it worked, that the regulatory structure federally, statewide, and at the local level just only wanted big businesses, none of you would be in this room. And here you are. So I think there is reason to have some careful confidence.
Naomi, so oftentimes when, the news likes to focus on a little bit of what Reed was talking about, right? So there's this big machine in Washington, and their agencies are pumping out all these regulations. But when you talk about the notices that Minda was kind of referring to, that are the ones that actually get sent to small business owners, those typically don't come from the White House. They're typically from their local government, their state government, county governments. What's happening on the state level or even local level? And I know you talked a little bit about this given your study. What is it that we should be aware of? What are they doing on these levels that are impacting businesses?
We've got a few things happening. I mean, certainly businesses are subject to federal, state, local, just a multitude of regulations, which are basically hidden taxes in many cases. The tax, as well as tax regulations, OSHA regulations, health regulations, and all levels of government. And so, you're really looking at a situation where you've got government, in many cases, hindering small business formation and development and expansion even before you turn on the lights and get going for the business day. And so one of the things that I'm seeing nationally in a multitude of states is you're seeing a lot more moves towards implementing policy goals like minimum wage, like stopping rideshare type businesses, things like home-based businesses, the other things like food trucks. And so typically what you see is you not only see these multiple layers, you also see the attempt to implement these policies on multiple levels of government simultaneously, and I think it's really important to recognize that in many of these cases, you're looking at entrepreneurs are risk takers. They're people who are job creators. They're people who are willing to put it out on the line every single day. And you've got a regulatory regime of individuals, some of them who are very well intentioned, of course, but others who are really their goal is to build their own fiefdoms of regulatory regime and to continue to grow that and to penalize people who are taking the risks and creating the jobs. And so I think it's really important. I think just in a nutshell, you're really being hit from all levels and all sides all the time, unfortunately. And I think that is one of the very tragic things that we're seeing in this country from an economic standpoint, is that you're being hindered before you even start. And I think that the culture around innovation, around creation, has got to change. You've got really great pockets of innovation around the country, but I think that's a direct result of the cultures of those regulatory regimes, of those governors, of those political systems that really do embrace entrepreneurship. And that's, you see a lot of different outcomes. Those outcomes, I think, are directly tied to those approaches to the risk takers and entrepreneurs and job creators.
The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics put out a report this week looking at the delicensing of occupations by local governments. We've spent a good time so far talking about how things keep being added to the rolls. How often do we see governments take the step to delicense or deregulate a certain business and industry?
That it almost never happens, but we're very happy when it does. You've got, I believe it was recently in Ottawa, if I'm not mistaken. I just read an article about how they're moving towards a regulatory system where they're actually going to start to automatically roll back regulation. In Texas, you had the Sunset Commission that took a look at regulation, and you have a lot of sunsetting of laws. I think sunsetting laws is a really important step to take. I think also assessing the impact that certain regulations will have on businesses is also something that is absolutely necessary. You have to have the lawmakers and politicians understand that if you implement policy X, the cost on small businesses is going to be X amount, is going to be Y amount of dollars. That has got to be done. And I think it's also important to raise a point that in many cases, regulations are oftentimes promoted and pushed by other businesses. And that's something that I think this idea that there's a zero-sum game in the economy is absolutely completely false. When you take a look at states that are thriving, that have enormous economic growth, I think the pie isn't this big. The pie can grow. And so the more that businesses can get out of the business of trying to regulate their competitors, I think that'll be another important step forward.
So they keep writing them, and it's hard to take them off. Now, do you have something to add, Reed?
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So my next question is actually to you, so I'm glad you grabbed the mic. You knew where I was going. So they're writing them, and most of the time they're supposed to be writing it under, current law, the Regulatory Act, and as you mentioned, the public hearing and the posting and the review and comment period. But you mentioned in one of the things you mentioned earlier was this idea of stealth regulation. So now it's not just that the Federal Register has all of these pages that we don't have the time to go through, but now there's other agencies doing acts that impact businesses of even that regime. You mentioned Operation Choke Point. I know from polls that oftentimes many small business owners are saying, things that are holding or impeding success are government regulations, taxes, but also access to capital is very important for the Hispanic entrepreneur. How is Operation Choke Point playing into that part of the hurdles that are facing entrepreneurs?
So it's interesting. As a result, again, a lot of this, to really understand where we sit today, to really understand it sometimes you have to do some digging into history. As a result of bank failures in the 1930s, the federal government did really two things. One, it enacted an insurance program, the FDIC insurance, and if you go, you see, your deposits are insured up to $100,000 or whatever the number is today. The other thing, though, it put into place a regulatory program in order to ensure that banks didn't get involved in things that they should not. And in the authorizing statutes, there's a phrase about reputational risk. So a bank examiner can come into your bank, take a look, and make sure you're not making loans to people who are unlikely to pay them back. And the system worked pretty well, and it sort of sat for many, many years, and then came 9/11. And one of the issues that the FBI and the other authorities were dealing with was the movement of huge sums of money from the United States through banks and companies that wire money and so forth to the Middle East. During the 1990s, for example, a number of the more famous terrorist groups, including the Taliban, got most of their money from communities inside the United States who were sending money overseas. So the government said, well, we have to stop this. We have to dry up the supply of money, which it did actually pretty effectively. So 2004 already, a lot of progress has been made in there. It sits. Well, some new people come in and they say, hey, we have all these wonderful, wonderful tools that allow us to go to the bank examiners and say, we don't like this business, we don't like that business. When you go to the banks, say to them, hey, we may think that for example, providing credit facilities or a bank account for any one of a number of companies. Payday lenders is a classic example. Gun shops, pawn shops, other kinds of small businesses that we don't like. You know, you just go to the bank, Mr. Bank Examiner, and say, hey, you know, it's a nice bank you got here. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it, because we don't want to have to come in and audit you. You don't want us to come in and do an examination. And the banks, which have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, a lot fewer community banks for a whole bunch of reasons, the last thing they want is an audit. The last thing they want is the word to get out that, you know, on the street that the federal government's looking at their loan policies, because that's going to affect share price. So people become very touchy, and when there is a suggestion made that, you know, it maybe not be such a good idea that you provide credit to these kinds of businesses, well, they take the hint. And so if you watch the news carefully, and if you've been watching it over really the past about 18 months, you'll see stories of small businesses who all of a sudden their bank accounts are closed. They can't get accounts. They can't get loans. And many of these businesses are not, none of them are illegal. Many of them are actually regulated at the state or local level. And they're all law-abiding. But somebody in Washington has decided it would be better if they did not exist. And there's been congressional hearings. There are investigations. Our organization is trying to find out sort of who's calling the shots and why. But it's very hard to find out what the government is up to. What we do know is that bank accounts are being closed. A class of legal businesses are being denied access to the things they need to be able to survive.
And so they were able to do this without the typical process of public hearings, et cetera. How then does a small business owner even connect the dots? How do they know if their access to capital or their bank accounts are being shut down, that this is a result of these actions that are actually taking place from Washington?
Well, what we have are really the reports of some of the business owners involved, where they'll get calls from their bank. And in one case, there was a fellow who had a business, and he had a banking relationship that had lasted many years, and was friends with the local bank manager, who called him and said, listen, I'm sorry, but we got to close your accounts. We're getting pressure from the Home Office, which is getting pressure from Washington. And you know, at that point in time, it's sort of a survival issue for the business. And going to Minda's point, at that point you have to look for outside resources and begin to push back, because you know, the government is not so dissimilar from anyone else. It will, you know, the bureaucrats will go as far as they can go until somebody says you will go no further, and draws a line in the sand.
So as an example,
Yep.
my call probably in the morning, since we're on a 2-hour time difference, is going to be to Karen Harnett, who Reed works with at NFIB, and start saying, hey, what are our members feeling? I mean, that is the one thing. Remember, when something, you know, gets hit by the antiseptic rays of sunlight, there are people listening. So if you're in the middle of that right now, is that helpful? If you already got your bank account closed down, not so much. But it isn't static. But those are the things. Those are the things that are of big concern. Is what is the right kind of small business? Really? You know, I personally, you know, I don't like dairy, so we shouldn't have ice cream shops. You know, I mean, if you start thinking about it, those are the things that you kind of have to listen for and listen in the conversations. And again, you have to be you have to be diligent, but you can't afford to be afraid, and you can't afford to just be reactive. And you have the tools to do that. But this is the kind of thing that is just really, really frightening.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's very scary, because right to what you said. Who decides what a good small business is? I mean, in America, that's supposed to be the market that decides that. If people no longer need your services or no longer want to go to you, that's what will be the indicator of closing the door, not an agency in D.C. that's saying, by all other means, you are a legal business. We just think perhaps you're a little shady and the banks shouldn't be operating.
Well, or we just don't like the cut of your jib, to use an old phrase. And,
sure.
And one thing, a little commercial for Libre. Libre has stood up and spoken out against this. Cause of Action was pleased to represent Libre, and we filed a friend of the court brief in an ongoing case about choke point,
right,
where we discuss and made clear the impact on Hispanic entrepreneurs, but really on all entrepreneurs, as the adverse impact of this government action. So there are resources, but you know, at some point you've got to be willing to step up and protect your business and protect your livelihood. And there will be people to help you. But it starts with your willingness to say enough.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. Libre is looking into this issue, has been active, and if any of you think that you have somehow been impacted or know somebody who's been impacted, please see me after. I would love to hear the story and see if there's something we can look into that for. But Minda, moving along. So I want to go back. We started talking about, we've gone from state, federal. I want to talk a little bit more about states. You know, you, proud New Mexican, you understand what it's like to be a small business owner in this state. We actually had a question, which I think we could relate both to New Mexico or even other states. They were specifically asking about California, because California is known for having very high levels of regulation, and what they're seeing is that many businesses have decided to leave the state. At what point, whether it's California or whether it's New Mexico or, you know, any of the 50 states, at some point, going back to what you were saying earlier, are the elected officials listening to the small business owners, and what does it take for them to actually say, maybe we shouldn't do this, or maybe we need to fix this, and will they actually do it?
That's a good question. First, free advertising, anyone who has a small business that's in California, New Mexico, we want you here. We're ready. So please come. I had to make that pitch. But that is the thing, as you say, about listening to your, you know, how do you get your elected officials to listen to you? That's the thing where, as an individual and as a small business owner, frankly, at the state level, you have your elected officials. Let's just use your state legislature as an example. Unless you live where your business is, you're represented by 2 different representatives and maybe even 2 senators, because there's where you live and you're a constituent as an individual, and then you're a constituent as a business. This may sound very, very very old-fashioned, but not necessarily 2 months before an election, but other times, give them a call. Say, I want to come talk to you. Come see my business. May I, you know, can we have a cup of coffee? Can I talk to you for 15 minutes after this town hall you're doing? You all need to express and say, I have concerns. I'm proud of my business. This is what my business brings into the community, and I want you to understand that some of the things you do make it very, very hard. Suddenly, they have a face, and it's a lot harder to discount someone telling you their personal story, not complaining, saying you sorry, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you do things that are smart? But if you say, hey, I'm your constituent, and I want you to understand what I'm doing for myself and where I need help from you. It's amazing. Legislators who get 10 phone calls from constituents saying this is a problem during the session, they do listen. What often gets not understood or dismissed is that in politics, it's a high-touch arena. 10 phone calls makes a difference. Now, you can get caught in saying, I am so busy. I don't have time to do this. I shouldn't have to do this. They should understand, probably, but that's not it. The way that you make things better for yourself is to go do that. You just make the call. They don't even have to be from the same party. You don't even have to say whether or not you voted for them. But that is one piece that we find small businesses won't do, is make that phone call, spend that hour. The second thing, read the paper. Keep up on what's going on. You have, like, I'll use the Hispano Chamber again. That's what they do. They're listening. And so when you join with other voices, or if you have, 3 of you that are in business, just say, I brought along 2 of my other people that I know. They may not be your constituent, but you know what? They're in our business community too. We really want you to hear what's going on. Your elected officials, even at the city council, whatever, they will give you their ear. That's a start. If they start getting in the habit of hearing more and more from small business, they will start listening more. But it requires patience, tenacity, and being polite. Those are doable. So,
Very doable. Not easy, but doable.
not easy, but it's a start. And then other things start coming in. When you take that first step, then you're going to start finding help is the second step away. And
Sure.
we have to tell our story.
Naomi, your study, I thought one of the most interesting parts of it was when you looked at states with high Hispanic populations and high Hispanic entrepreneurship levels. I would assume, and I think most people would as well, if you have a high Hispanic population, you have a high entrepreneur index, your state is doing fine, Hispanics are entrepreneur, they're going to continue to succeed. Is that correct?
So one of the really interesting things was what Jorge just pointed out, and that is, I assume too that if you have a whole lot of Hispanics and you have a whole lot of Hispanic businesses, you're automatically going to have a really favorable and hospitable environment for Hispanic new business formation. It turns out not to actually be the case. What does provide the most hospitable environment are low taxes, low regulations, access to capital, all of the same things that entrepreneurs need to get started and to expand. And so that was, this is really, I think, a really important point to tag onto your last question about people moving from California to other states. One of the most interesting things, the post-recession economy that you've seen is you've seen some states growing gangbusters, creating jobs, and then you've seen some states losing jobs. And I think that that's going to be one of the most interesting stories in the post-recession economy is what states have succeeded and what states have failed. And the bottom line, I think, for policymakers and for businesses and I think businesses already understand this, but businesses need they need a lot of predictability. But more importantly, they need to be in an economy, in an area where policymakers truly understand and appreciate the risks that they're taking and what they're putting out there on the line in order to be successful, but also creating an economic environment that is going to withstand economic shocks. We know there will be economic shocks. The price of oil will go up. It'll go down. We'll have things happen in the economy. But as long as you've created an environment where the would-be business owner or the small business owner who's thinking about expanding, as long as they understand that you're going to have a fair playing field, that you're going to treat them treat them in a way that respects that they are taking enormous risk and that they are the engines of your economic growth in your geographic area, then I think you are creating a truly hospitable environment. And unfortunately, you're not seeing the rapid Hispanic entrepreneurship in some of the places where you might automatically think of. Instead, you're seeing it in maybe in some other states where maybe there isn't a large Hispanic population, but Hispanics are absolutely willing to go there and start a business because as a population, we're not risk averse. I mean, we'll go and try it and we'll do it and we'll start out new. And so they're going to areas around the country where there is that environment, and they a lot of businesses fail, but overall these businesses will succeed in those hospitable environments that are providing that.
That leads to the question. Here is the difference. When you're talking about tax policy, you will hear states saying, we're going to create a good tax policy and we're going to lower the corporate income tax rate. The thing that seems to be lost on our state legislatures is that the majority of small businesses and entrepreneurs are sole proprietors or limited liability companies. Lowering the corporate income tax rate, I get a little animated on this, lowering the corporate rates doesn't do anything for small business. You want to get a message to your leaders, and we are trying to do that in all states, and here in New Mexico. There has to be a way to separate out a small business from a high income wage earner. You look the same on the law books. You look the same in tax policy. And I don't care how many business write-offs you have. I don't. But that is the problem. Corporate income tax does not help you. So you can be giving these big tax breaks and incentives. That does not help you. That is a hill that we are actively crawling up over and over again for them to understand your structure has to be dealt with, and that's one of the issues in New Mexico too. It's in a lot of states, and it just seems to be a hard concept. Well, hard can be done, and that's where we're pushing on a policy front to say, look, you have to look at ways to do that. So whenever anybody talks about, well, you have all these high wage individuals. Well, if you make, I love this, if you make $250,000, you're rich. You say, no, I'm a business owner. And every dollar that I don't have to pay to the government and every dollar that I'm not spending on keeping my business going is a dollar that I am using for expansion to hire more people. Business people, we need our policymakers to think of economic growth vis-a-vis taxes as horizontal. More taxpayers rather than more taxes from fewer taxpayers. And that is a message that you need to go forward as we're going forward with you, is I am not a high wage earner. I'm not using it to go on vacation. I am using it to grow my business. We're job creators. We need the money to create jobs, and that you need to be politely strident about.
Reed, I feel like you want to jump in on
that's
this.
a great point. And when you're talking about tax policy, though, if you conceptualize regulatory burden as a tax, in fact, there's a lot of really good data now that shows that for small firms, defined as those with less than 50 workers, just the federal regulatory burdens about $12,000 per worker per year. For larger businesses, though, for a whole bunch of reasons, the federal regulatory burden is about $9,000 per year. So you are paying much, much more, a third more in regulatory tax as a small business than your larger competitors. And that message has been lost. Picking up on a point Minda made about your need to engage, I can guarantee you that the other side is very much engaged. The folks who are pushing regulations, whatever their motives, are very much engaged, and they have a lot of resources behind them. Don't kid yourself. So if you're not out there, you're going to get rolled over.
So in talking about this idea of regulatory hidden taxes, I know one that's very popular, loosely defined as popular, is the Affordable Care Act. And there's this whole scheme and system in place, especially when it comes to businesses, which is trying to, in a way, kind of either govern or manipulate the way that they operate with their employees, with the use and threat of these penalties as a way to get them to do that. Minda, what does that mean for a business owner who is thinking about expanding now that this year coming up, they have to start keeping track if their employee is no more than 30 hours? What does it mean to have to calculate full-time equivalency? Understanding penalties that may or may not change depending on if you want to help your employees get insurance. How does that impact someone who's at the end of the day trying to bring on more employees, open a second store?
Well, the off-the-cuff answer is just say no. No, I'm not going to expand. No, I'm not going to hire anyone else. No, sorry, I think I'm happy. I'm just going to keep my head down and wait for all of this to pass. You know you're not going to do that. That's not why you're in business. This is a real problem. The 30-hour part-time line is something you have to really pay attention to, because a full-time equivalent is when you add up all the hours of all your part-time people, you divide it by 120, and that's how many full-time people they represent. So you have to be thinking about that. You have to be thinking about the reporting. Right now we're in a time where you just really have to keep track of your employees, how often how long you're having them work, and what your structure is. I don't know that right now, and maybe Naomi has an answer, I don't know that there is relief right now in what we're looking at. The other thing is when you hear insurance premium, it's another word for tax. That's part of it too. The latest thing I was just reading about the state Medicaid programs, and they were saying about how they're having to pump all this money into the states. Well, they had said that there was going to be a fee on health insurance providers, so they would be getting so many more people insured that they could have this extra fee to go to support the system. Guess what? They passed it through on individual insurance policies and for small business policies. Are we just shocked? Are we? That this got passed through. So that's what you're talking about as a hidden tax. Whenever you hear the word fee, that's something. And in the world of premiums, that's where the hidden tax is. But the 30 hours, I think, I know NFIB is looking at legislation in Congress to visit this. I'm sure Libre is looking at it to say, whoa, wait, what are the unintended consequences of this? How is this going to impact expansion? Why would you do it if you always have to have a calculator? So,
Naomi, I know you've done a great deal on healthcare research as well.
Yeah, specifically on the 30-hour per week rule under the Affordable Care Act, there has already been an enormous amount of fallout. We just don't know how much yet, but it is going to be massive. I looked at this about a year and a half ago. You're already seeing a lot of educational institutions cutting back their instructors' hours to below 30 hours a week, which is having an enormous amount of impact on those institutions as well as those individuals. But I think that if I recall correctly, I looked at data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the three lowest wage industries: food and beverage, retail, and general merchandise. And I think that if I recall correctly, that data was available for about 14 or 15 states around the country. What I saw was that since the Affordable Care Act passed, you saw a growing employment, but a reduction in, I think, 14 or 15 of those states in the number of hours that these employees were working. And that is absolutely completely unusual in a growing economy. And there could be a number of explanations that need to be examined, but the bottom line is that as a business owner, you are not going to expand. You are not going to bring on more people if it's going to trigger enormous penalties, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars on your firm by hiring an additional person. You're just not going to do it. It doesn't make any sense. And the particularly frustrating and infuriating part about this is that if you're a small business doing the right thing, providing health insurance for your employees, you're still going to get hit with a penalty if it's not qualified and affordable. And so there are a lot more rules being put on, and these are in fact, even though they're regulations, they are in fact taxes and on those firms. And I really do worry about how this particular rule is going to impact workers, particularly in the lowest wage industries, where a lot of people do work. They fluctuate hours, and their ability to get more hours is heavily dependent, on how that business is doing. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of very negative repercussions throughout the country on this from this one particular rule.
And so hold on one second. I've been given the light of, or the notice that we're running out of time. It's amazing how much an hour and 15 minutes can fly when you're talking about regulations. But I had some good questions from the audience. I'm going to try to combine them and just give you each about 1 to 2 minutes to give us your final answer. We've been seeing an economy that's still, in many parts, struggling to get out of the recession. And since that time, there's been disturbing news that small businesses are either closing at an accelerated rate or new business startups are declining. Do you think, two-part kind of question here, is that a result of still the lingering recession? Is it a money or market issue? Is it a regulation issue? And If so, or either one of those or all of those, what can folks do now to hopefully create change, both maybe immediately in a year and a half, but even so in the long term? And Minda, if you want to start, we'll just go down the panel.
Well, the answer is all of the above. I think there really is a combination. Did the person who wrote this, or do you live in New Mexico by any chance? Okay. Well, but because I was going to say that the New Mexico is behind in the recession, and so it is really creating problems. I don't know that there is an answer. I think perhaps what it will require is really looking at, I want to expand, what is it going to take? And looking at that and really weighing, what are my resources, what are my obstacles, really looking at it and just seeing what the potential pathway is, because you are going to have to be innovative. But again, I think that there are ways and folks to help you to look at this. In answer, yes, the marketplace, we are in a recession. We do have regulations. Expansion requires a lot of work. The truth is, public policy is underneath every aspect of business. Before you opened your doors, you had to get a license, or you had to see what laws you had to obey. Frankly, it stretches to all parts of our life. But you have to look at, what does expansion mean? The dream that you had that it looked like 12 years ago might not be correct. But with the innovation and other things that are going on in the entrepreneurial communities, you may be surprised at what potential expansion looks like. Speaking of banks, you know, we now have credit unions that are venturing into different places. We have crowdfunding. We have micro-lending. With adversity comes people who change it into opportunity. What you're going to have to do is be willing to look at it with a new eye and be willing to just put down on paper what you think all of the things that would have to be included, and then not say, no, I'm not going to expand, but maybe say, I'm going to expand at this time. I'm going to get this much towards my expansion done. Because the more you move toward, the more you're going to figure out that maybe even with the regulation that fit you here, with some changes, don't fit you there. It's not easy. It isn't, but you're brave, and independence is important. So I think what you have to do is figure out how to get there, ask for help, see someone who is where you are. Ask them. Read, you know, Google the successful people. You're going to find threads. And just accept that you're going to have late nights, you're going to have to make choices, but entrepreneurs got started because they found the workaround. So remember the workaround. You'll figure it out. And I know that may sound Pollyannish, but I truly believe it's true. And just write it down and take a good hard look.
Reed?
One of the reasons I am the Senior Vice President of Litigation is because I'm relatively senior. So I have had the opportunity to live through and experience a series of economic downturns. There was the one in the oil shocks of the late 70s and Jimmy Carter. There was the stock market crash of 89 and the failures of the S&Ls. There was the tech bubble. And then there's been, you know, this latest crash, which has been historically bad. The data, any way you want to cut it, is unprecedented. We have the lowest level of workforce participation now at any point since the 1930s. An entire generation is going to suffer long-term effects in terms of their economic performance because of what happened between about 2007 and frankly today. it was not all the result of regulation. But regulation has had a lot to do with the reason that this has continued for as long as it has, and the reason it has been as bad as it is. That's just a fact. Right. But for fracking, which between 2009, I want to say, and about 2011, was the only net generator of jobs in the United States. And understand that fracking received less federal support than the federal government gave to Solyndra. Remember Solyndra? Okay. More money went to Solyndra than went from the Department of Energy for all of the fracking research. This was something the private sector did pretty much on its own. Take that away and take a look at the job numbers during this period of time. It would have been, unimaginably bad. So, the folks are sort of scratching their heads and trying to figure out what's going on. Interest rates are at historic lows, not just here, but worldwide, and everybody's trying to figure out where do we go from here. There's a lot of big issues, but let me bring it back to the regulatory piece. Where do we go from here? There are efforts now in the U.S. Congress to try and bring about some reforms to the way that the federal government does regulatory stuff. The idea being to make the system more open, more accountable, to make it harder for the bureaucrats to impose multi-billion-dollar obligations on the American people, while saying at the same time, no, we're creating benefits, and without having actually to justify in any material way what those benefits are. EPA, for example, in the last several, since 2000, roughly 2000, has promulgated 17 rules that have had more than $1 billion costs each on the U.S. economy. And they claim that there are benefits. The benefits relate to only one of those specific rules, and they are frankly unquantifiable. It is, the old phrase was voodoo economics. Well, EPA is perhaps the premier practitioner of voodoo economics in the United States today. So Congress is going to try and fix it. The last time this happened in any serious way was during the 1990s, because then President Clinton actually cared about reforming the federal regulatory system. Little known fact. But they did a lot of very interesting things, and there was a bill that came out of Congress that had bipartisan support. It was passed by the Senate Judiciary Committee 14-0. And it would have made substantial reform, and it would have made things a lot better. But the environmentalists got a hold of it, and it died for political reasons. Well, it's come back, and people are trying again. But there needs to be a counterweight to the environmentalists and to the other people who are going to, the special interests, frankly, who are going to try and keep the system as it is, which is to say it's opaque and it works for the bureaucrats and not for the people. So unless the people are willing to stand up through NFIB and through Libre and through, you're on your own 2 feet, and unless you're willing to push back when the regulators come knocking and they're overreaching by calling people like cause of action, it's going to fail again. And frankly, I'm tired of failure. I think you all are tired of failure. You're in business to succeed. Unfortunately, this is something I think that you all have got to decide you're going to take on a little bit a week to follow these issues, to write a letter, to reach out to folks who have kind of our viewpoint, who believe in the free market system, and who are willing to actually stand up and be counted.
Thank you, Naomi.
Those interests that are interested in regulating other businesses, you've got to be watching that too. They count on your not caring about what that other industry is going through or what's going on over there. They know that whenever it's your turn, no one else is going to be watching. And so I think that's going to be really important. There will always be ups and downs in the economy. There will be shocks to the economy. But what you've got to have in your area, whether it's local or state, is an environment where government isn't hindering your ability to either establish yourself or to expand. And I think any time a business is going to leave because of the the regulatory regime, that needs to be amplified to the extent possible to every lawmaker and every media outlet. Anytime someone leaves because of the economy, because of regulations, and especially if they're going somewhere else that you've already lost jobs to, that's got to be front and center so that lawmakers and those people that are issuing the regulations feel uncomfortable about doing that again.
So I started this panel by saying thank you, and I want to end it on the same note. Thank you to the panelists. I think we all learned a little bit something today from the knowledge that you've shared. And then thank you to all of you for taking the time to sit with us. We hope that we provided you with some good resources to take back to your businesses. Thank you.